I remember my father playing the fiddle. That's sort of my first musical memory, is his dad playing, like coming home. He worked away 5 days a week for this construction company in Ontario called Ellis Dawn. And so he was gone Monday to Friday, and he would come home on a Friday night kind of tired, and we'd have supper, and the next thing you know, he'd be up in the bedroom in this worn out green chair he had, and he used to have an earpiece he'd plug into the tape player, and he'd play along with Winston Fitzgerald records, and I'd take the guitar and chord with him. That's how I learned to make bar chords and all the stuff, all that initial early learning was all done that way. My father was a smoker. His whole life, he was supposed to have quit smoking, but he told my mother he quit, but he never quit, I don't think, because he always smelled of cigarettes, and I'm sure he used to tell my mother that it was like the other guys were on the job site working and smoking, but it was really him. And I never knew what that smell really was, because there were smokers in the house all the time when I was a kid. I ended up being a smoker myself, and it wasn't until years later, well into my 40s, that I actually recognized that smell and associated it with my dad. Like, geez, that's what my father used to smell like, and he wasn't well. He grew up hard and sick. He had asthma, and just, they didn't really expect him to live. He was born in Shetty Camp, Cape Breton Island, and in those days everybody smoked. I saw black and white pictures of kids in the 20s and 30s in Shetty Camp all sitting on their bicycles smoking cigarettes, hand rolls, and so he just automatically started smoking. It was what he did. Everybody did it. And I'm sure as he aged and really couldn't work that much because his asthma was so bad, and they used to prescribe smoking for asthma patients, right? So it was like a double whammy on him. And as he grew older and became a better fiddler, they say that he was the best fiddler that ever came out of that town. And as he got older and started going to parties and dances and weddings and all these things, I mean, it was impossible to get away from cigarettes, and it was impossible to get away from alcohol. And so, yeah, I mean, it must have been an interesting time for him, he was born in 1921, I think, or 1920. And he died in 1977. So, yeah, it was must have been weird times for him, I'll tell you that. But those are my first memories of music. My father and my mother. My mother played piano, and she tried to play with my dad, but she wasn't really that good a piano player for what they call Scotch music. She was a church organist when she was a kid, and she could read music, and she played out of the hymnals and played popular songs like from her era. She called them the war songs, stuff out of the 30s and 40s. And yeah, so I remember that happening a lot. There was parties at the house and lots of drinks and young people around. I had two brothers that were around when I was a child, Bob and Joe, and there was another two. That one I didn't really meet until I was about 8 years old, and another one I didn't meet until I was, I think, 13 before I ever met him. My family was fairly bizarre. My mother had a fairly horrific childhood, fending off her father, who, by all accounts, was one of the most evil men in the whole area where she grew up. And yeah, he was a bit of a legend in the valley of Nova Scotia. There, his name was Les Hoffman, and he. I suppose the only way to describe him was heartless. He didn't seem to have a heart or any empathy for any other human beings. He tortured my mother's mother until she died of cervical cancer, and my mother was left with him and her grandmother, whose name was Bruce. Her last name was Bruce. She came from the old country in Edinburgh. And my mother used to tell me nightmare stories about what it was like being in that house when she was a kid, like her father being drunk and violent and beating her mother and her brothers and two brothers, three brothers actually, sorry, Tim, Bud, and Richard. They called him Dick. Les used to beat the living crap out of these kids, just these boys all the time, and beat his wife down on the floor, and she died of cervical cancer right in front of my mother. My mother was trying to care for her, like giving her palliative care, I guess, right there in the house. And when the end came, it was just something out of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Somebody sitting in a big armchair in the parlor downstairs and hemorrhaging to death in front of my mother. Like she told me graphic stories about that, and how badly that affected her, and then her father was raping her, and it was a nightmare. And she finally got away when she was, I don't know, she got away. This is sort of how this all ties in, is that in her efforts to get away from her father, she struck up a relationship with a young guy there in town, and she had 2 kids by him. The first one, whose name she called her Heather, the grandmother Bruce took the baby from her when she was the minute she was born, and swaddled it up, and they took it down to this place out in Stewiacke, or Shubenacadie. I can't remember where that place is, but there was an orphanage out there apparently where they regularly smothered babies and buried them in the back of the building in these butter boxes. And that became a play and a book and a scandal. And that's where my mother was told her firstborn was, smothered in a blanket and buried behind the orphanage. And this is before anybody knew about the butterbox babies, right? And it's really weird. Like, it's so strange that kind of history is attached to my family. But the point being, they didn't kill the baby. My grandmother was my great grandmother. My great grandmother Bruce was an asshole, and so she told my mother this horror story to hurt her. I don't know what was going on. I don't know what the dynamic was between those two, but whatever it was wasn't healthy. And so then there was another boy. Then my mother got pregnant again by the same guy, and this time she ran and ended up down in Digby with a woman named Viva. And I've never been able to discern who Viva really was. We called her Aunt Viva, and she was not related to us. She was a Gidney, as far as I know. And my mother had the second child down there and left the child with Viva. And we didn't discover this second child, this first boy she had, until well into my early childhood. I was 13 years old, like I said, when I met my oldest brother. So if we take a look at the family unit, there was a family unit, but it was the sheer level of dysfunction in my family was absolutely unbelievable. And so if we take a look at my siblings, who pretty well shaped my life, Next after me, 16 years older than me, is my brother Joe. So he was born and then after him, 18 years older than me, my brother Bob, and then 20 years older than me, David. Somewhere in the mix there was another sister. So in other words, my parents had 4 children. They had me, Joe, Bob. Sorry, 5 children. Bob, Nanette, and David. So the sister, Nanette, I never met her until I was maybe 7 years old. And the reason I didn't meet her was because she was the second born after David. And when my family was living in Shetty and they were completely destitute. My father was a carpenter. And you can imagine how much money there was to be had in the 50s, the 40s and 50s in Shetty It was nothing there. And they literally they didn't have enough money to take care of Nanette. They didn't have enough money to feed all the kids. So my father took Nanette to his parents and left her with his parents, my grandparents on my father's side. And now the story goes that the real reason he took her there was because he was afraid my mother was going to kill her. My mother didn't like girls, and I think it was because she everything about having a little girl around the house just reminded her of her own childhood, which was horrendous. So she didn't treat Nanette too well, I guess. But my brothers say she was a spoiled little brat. So it was 6 of one, half dozen of the other. But again, my sister Nanette went on to be a very successful woman, and she wrote a book called A Child is Crying Under the Stairs, which also became a play. And it was a very well-received book, and it was all about my mother and about what my mother did to her when she was a little girl. Even though she was taken away, like my father left her with his parents when she was 6 or 7 years old. So it's hard to say what she really remembers about anything, but I can definitely believe that my mother mistreated her, because my mother mistreated everybody. So there was the family. So when I was a child, when I was a little boy growing up, I had Mom, I had Dad, and I had Bob and Joe. David had long since moved away to Thunder Bay. He moved out of the house when he was 16, never came back. Nana and I hadn't met, didn't even know about her. My mother used to talk about her from time to time, but I didn't know her. The Butterbox baby, Heather, she had been adopted and under another name entirely. She took the name. Somebody named her Sharon, her adoptive parents. So she was out there, and the other boy that was born down in Digby, James, my half brother, another half sibling. He was down in Digby with the Gidneys. His name was James Gidney. So there was already this incredibly complex problem going on in my family. I didn't know anything about it. All I knew was that I loved music. Music kept me going through because there was so much going on at my house. Between my mother being addicted to prescription medications and an alcoholic, and my father's an alcoholic too, except he wasn't a mean alcoholic. He was just a sloppy drunk. He was the nicest man ever I think I ever met in my life. The guy was a saint. He should have been sainted for being able to live with my mother. And so that was the environs that I was in when I was 3-4 years old, and I started to take a severe interest in the turntable. My brother Joe, the next one after me, he still lived at home. And the next brother, Bob, he was always coming around too. So they both had vinyl collections. And so between being exposed to fiddle music constantly by my father, and my brothers playing Gordon Lightfoot records and Doc Watson records and Kingston Trio and the Beatles. Oh my God, Bob was the biggest Beatles fan ever. And so I just grew up in this really weird concoction, this potpourri of music that spanned everything from Celtic to folk to, one of my favorite records when I was a kid was a Christopher Parkening album, Christopher Parkening is like one of the premier classical guitarists who ever lived, a student of Segovia. So I was listening to everything. I was hearing things. It just seemed like when I look back at my childhood, I kind of see, I see it in eras, short little eras, like the times between when I received new music from people, because we had very little money, and my father, the reason now see, that's another whole story altogether, which is another part of why I became the type of musician I did. In 1965, my mother and father just got tired of the destitution that they were living in. Like I said, earlier, they had already basically given up a child for, basically the reason they couldn't feed her and take care of her properly. They just couldn't make any money. My father couldn't make any money. And so they loaded up and ended up in Great Village, because they moved to the mainland. They went to Great Village, Nova Scotia, where he got a little more working, and he started to work on larger construction projects. He built the first curving bridge that's down in Wentworth, and he also built this railroad trestle that goes across the highway there. And he proved to be a brilliant carpenter and foreman for this construction company he got a job with. And this is a man who had a grade 2 education. That's all he had. He went to grade 2. And he could build these massive projects with barely looking at a blueprint. And so they told him that he should go to work in Ontario for Ellis Don. And so in 67 or 68, I think, actually, they loaded everything up and moved. My mother, father, Bob, and Joe all moved to Ontario. London, Ontario. That would become one of the foundations for my musical journey, is where I was born and what I was exposed to so early, and the people I met, and the fact that we all kind of went up there at the same time would set the stage for something later on that would happen, that would again make a major dent in my formation as a musician. And so there they were in London, Ontario, 1967 or 68. My father working in Ellis Don Construction, building the nuclear power plant down in Kincardine at Bruce Point. And he was making $12 an hour in 1967 or 8, and it was the most money he'd ever seen in his life. And in 1969, my mother came pregnant. She was 47 years old, and my father was 50. And so it was an utter shock. My father was not planning on having any more kids. It's the whole reason that they got so messed up, is trying to raise all these kids on no money, and how here he was at 50 years old in ill health, and his wife pregnant again. So I was born in 1969, London, Ontario, which, as I said, set the stage for some interesting things. Being born into a Cape Breton family, basically, but not being in Cape Breton. It was Cape Breton inside our house, but outside, it was a metropolitan Upper Canada society that was nothing like the East Coast. People there are not the same at all, and that's how things started. That's the first time I ever heard my dad. That's where I was the first time I ever heard my dad play the fiddle.